Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we drift into a gentle fairy tale, our own soft retelling of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a story of innocence and jealousy, of danger, kindness, and the quiet courage that awakens even in the darkest of woods. If this bedtime tale brings you peace, feel free to like and subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Now let the world grow quiet, and step with me into this moonlit, enchanted forest where Snow White's journey begins. Now, before we drift too far into tonight's tale, I want to share something small and quiet with you. Something that settled into my heart the moment I heard it. It's an old Chinese proverb, perhaps familiar to you, or perhaps as new and unexpectedly comforting as it was to me. Whatever the case, it carries a gentle wisdom worth holding close as we move through our lives, step by step. It says, "If you want happiness for an hour, take a nap. If you want happiness for a day, go fishing. If you want happiness for a year, inherit a fortune. But if you want happiness for a lifetime, help other people." So simple, and yet so unmistakably true. We humans often find ourselves chasing wealth, chasing comfort, chasing things that shimmer brightly for a moment and then fade away. But I think most of you listening tonight would agree. Nothing settles the heart. Nothing softens the soul. Nothing brings that warm, inner quiet, quite like showing kindness, offering compassion, extending a gentle hand to someone who needs it. And in our story tonight, you will find kindness like lanterns glowing softly in the dark, small lights that guide the way through envy, fear, and the darker parts of human nature. So, take a slow breath with me. Let the noise of the day slip away. It's time to wander into a world woven of imagination and old fairy magic. Picture, if you will, a storybook castle hidden deep within an ancient forest, where spells are used for both healing and harm, and where each whisper of wind carries the memory of something long ago. This is where our tale begins. Long, long ago, in a kingdom wrapped in winter's quiet embrace, a queen sat thoughtfully by her window, watching snowflakes drift like feathers from the heavens. She had almost everything a heart could wish for: a gentle husband, a home filled with warmth, loyal servants who cared for her deeply. And yet, there was one longing she could not shake, one empty space she could not fill. She wished for a child. Looking out over the wide, sparkling garden, a blanket of white stretching all the way to the shadowed line of the forest, she whispered her longing into the cold, bright sky. She wished for a daughter, a sweet baby girl with skin as pure and white as the falling snow, hair as dark as polished ebony, and lips as red as the first bloom of a winter rose. And because this was a time when magic still breathed in every corner of the world, her wish was heard. Not long after, the queen held a perfect little girl in her arms. When she placed the infant into the king's hands, they chose a name that honored the miracle of her birth. They called her Snow White, but joy can be fragile. And just a few years later, the good queen passed away, leaving the king alone with his precious child. He grieved deeply, yet he poured every part of his heart into raising the girl. And Snow White grew into a radiant, kind, curious little soul, the joy of the entire castle. Where other princesses might have become spoiled, Snow White remained humble and sweet. She spent her days wandering the gardens with the gardener, or chatting cheerfully with the housemaids, eager to help with their simple tasks. The castle was her world, warm and familiar, full of gentle faces and comforting routines. But the king was young, and solitude wore heavily upon him. In time, he found himself enchanted by the widow of one of his courtiers, a woman breathtaking to behold. Her hair shone like spun gold, and her skin was pale as ivory. With careful grace and quiet calculation, she won the king's admiration, and eventually his hand in marriage. When Snow White turned 13, the royal wedding took place, and she gained a new stepmother, elegant, poised, and cold as winter glass. There was nothing openly cruel about her, yet the castle shifted the moment she arrived. Servants whispered uneasily. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, as though shadows were gathering in the corners. Before the wedding, the queen had often praised Snow White in the king's presence, admiring her gentleness, her beauty, her clever mind. But once the crown rested upon her lovely head, her tone changed. Never openly, never where the king could hear, but in private, her voice toward Snow White became sharp and unkind. Even though Snow White was still only a child, the queen saw her blossoming beauty and felt threatened by it. Jealousy is a quiet poison. Slowly, subtly, the queen began to push Snow White aside. She neglected her education, refused to order her new clothes, and allowed the girl's daily comforts to fade piece by piece. With fewer lessons and fewer tasks of her own, Snow White spent more time among the servants. Soon, by the queen's command, she was doing some of their chores. And because it happened bit by bit, the king, occupied with matters of his realm, noticed nothing. Yet behind her polished charm, the queen hid a secret darker than anyone guessed. She was skilled in dangerous magic, ancient, forbidden, and powerful. And in the silence of night, she often slipped to her private chamber, stood before a tall mirror, and whispered, looking glass, on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" The mirror, swirling with mist and shadow, always answered, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." Satisfied, she would dismiss the spirit within and retire to her bed, convinced her beauty was undeniable. And so things continued, night after night, year after year, until the day Snow White turned 16. There was no grand celebration. The queen saw to that, but the king insisted on at least a small, formal dinner in honor of his daughter. And that is where the next chapter of our story begins. Softly, quietly, under the glow of flickering candles, where beauty, jealousy, and destiny were about to collide. Grudgingly, oh, so grudgingly, the queen had been forced to present her stepdaughter with a new gown for the grand occasion. She had spent hours choosing a fabric she believed would dull the girl's beauty, a color she felt sure would flatten the brightness of her cheeks. And yet, when Snow White stepped into the light, the queen could only watch in silent fury as the young girl seemed to glow, soft and radiant, as though wrapped in the last warmth of a summer morning. Later that night, when the festivities had ended and the halls had grown quiet, the queen shut herself away in her chamber, her heart thudding with sour jealousy. Seeking comfort, she drifted toward the tall mirror that had so often cradled her vanity. She stood prim and tense before it, smoothing her gown, steadying her breath, whispering the old familiar words meant to soothe her pride. Looking glass on the wall, who is the fairest of us all? But tonight, the mirror did not offer balm. Its voice, calm as moonlight, answered with a slow, sorrowful tremor. My queen, your beauty still shines bright, but the fairest is Snow White. The words struck her like cold water. For a long moment, she stood frozen, staring at her own reflection as if it might soften the blow. Yet deep in her heart, deep in the guarded place she never spoke of, she knew this moment had been coming. Snow White had grown lovelier with every passing year, lovelier than she had ever wished her to become. Pacing the chamber with a rising storm in her chest, the queen came to a decision, sharp and terrible in its clarity. Snow White would have to disappear, and the sooner it happened, the safer the queen's vanity and her crown would remain. Her plan, she felt, was almost childish in its simplicity. The king was away on business, and no one would question the queen's commands. She would send Snow White into the forest, far from any path or guiding light, and leave her there to perish. By the time the king returned and sent riders searching, the forest itself would be blamed. Bad luck, bitter weather, a simple, tragic misfortune. Using her cunning, the queen whispered an enchantment over a young kitchen maid, clouding the girl's thoughts until obedience was all she had left. Under the spell, the maid was instructed to lead Snow White deep into the wild woods in search of herbs, an errand that made little sense in the cold, windy days of autumn. But Snow White, gentle-hearted and trusting, questioned nothing. At dawn, with no witnesses stirring, Snow White rode out, wrapped in only her simple cloak, carrying nothing more than an empty basket. She shared a single horse with the enchanted maid, unaware that the creature would soon return home alone, its second rider lost among the trees. From the castle gates, the queen watched them depart, her hands clasped delicately, her smile small and secretive. From the high tower, she followed their dwindling figures until the forest canopy swallowed them whole, great branches swaying under a restless autumn wind. As they vanished, she allowed herself the sweet pleasure of imagining her next conversation with the faithful mirror. Everything, she told herself, would unfold exactly as planned. But far below, Snow White and the maid rode deeper into a world colder and darker than they knew. The spellbound servant urged the horse confidently into the gloom, while Snow White lifted her cloak collar and closed her eyes against the biting wind. Leaves, brown, gold, and brittle, swirled across their path. The air pinched at her nose and stung her ears. Still, the maid insisted gently that they must travel deeper, always deeper, into the tangle of brambles and twisted branches. At last, when Snow White no longer recognized a single landmark, the maid stopped the horse at the edge of a ravine. She pointed downward with mechanical certainty, telling the princess that the herb they sought grew below. Snow White hesitated. The place looked cold, unfriendly, abandoned by all living things. But she had spent her life trusting these servants, never imagining betrayal among them. So she dismounted, gathered her empty basket, and stepped into the downward brush. It did not take long before her dress was snagged, her hair tangled, her breath unsteady. She called to the maid for help, only to hear the wind's hollow cry echo back through the trees. Snow White pushed upward, back toward where she thought the horse waited, but found only silence. The maid was gone. A tremor of fear rose in her chest. For the first time in her sheltered life, she felt truly and utterly alone. The hours that followed blurred together, wandering without direction, calling out until her throat was raw, dropping her basket in exhaustion. The trees seemed to close around her, and every path she chose felt strangely familiar, as though the forest were turning her in circles. Her fingers grew numb, her feet cold, her heart heavy with hopelessness. When she finally believed she could not take another step, she noticed a flicker of shape in the distance, a small structure, half hidden between branches. She blinked away frozen tears and stumbled toward it, pushing past clawing twigs until she emerged into a clearing. Before her stood a little cabin, dark and silent beneath the faint winter light. Though hesitation tugged at her manners, desperation urged her forward. She knocked politely, but no answer came. And so, trembling, she pushed the door open and stepped inside, knowing the night would claim her if she didn't find shelter. At first, she could not see a thing. The hearth was cold, the windows dim. But gradually, her eyes adjusted, revealing a long wooden table with 3 chairs on either side and one at the head. Against the back wall stood 4 neat beds. Near the door, 3 more, 7 in all, each unmade, each waiting. The table was scattered with crumbs, with used plates, with half a loaf of bread left unguarded. Whoever lived here clearly cared little for tidiness. Weary to her bones, Snow White knelt by the hearth, gathered the wood stacked nearby, and coaxed a small fire to life. Soft orange light rose slowly, wrapping her like a warm sigh, and at last, at long, long last, she felt the first fragile whisper of safety. Once Snow White had coaxed a warm, cheerful blaze to life, little tongues of fire fluttering like sleepy birds. She felt her fingers returning to a soft tingle of warmth. Only then did her gaze fall upon the small loaf of bread resting on the table. She hadn't realized, not truly, how hollow her stomach felt. She had eaten nothing since leaving the castle that morning, and that moment felt now like some distant life she had dreamt long ago. Unable to resist, she washed a set of utensils with a bucket of cold water, her hands trembling with hunger, and quickly sliced herself a thick piece of bread. She sank into one of the tiny chairs, each of them curiously small, as though made for children, and devoured the slice as though it were a feast laid before a queen. Relief washed through her shoulders, loosening the tension she hadn't known she carried. Nearby rested a simple pitcher of water. She peered inside, found it full, and drank until it was empty. With food in her belly and the soft radiance of the fire warming her cheeks, a great drowsiness drifted over her like a gentle ribbon of fog. Her eyes fluttered. She told herself she would rest them only for a moment, just a moment. Her gaze drifted toward one of the beds, all small, all neatly made, all waiting. She laid herself gently atop the covers, careful not to disturb the blankets, whispering a silent promise to be polite, even in exhaustion. And then, before another thought could rise in her mind, she slipped into a deep, quiet, dreamless sleep. Late that night, when the moon had climbed high above the forest, the 7 tired owners of the little beds and the little chairs returned home. They pushed open the door and paused at once, for the fire still glowed faintly in the hearth. And upon one of their mattresses lay a strange girl, sleeping peacefully. One by one, the dwarves stepped inside, sturdy, brave, and wood-wise men of the forest, and stood in astonishment. They whispered softly among themselves, marveling at the sight. Yet something about the sleeping girl seemed gentle, harmless, almost fragile. Not wishing to wake her, they tiptoed into their own corners of the room, with one dwarf settling by the hearth to keep quiet watch until morning. Hours later, soft sunlight drifted through the tiny windows like golden dust. The young girl suddenly sat up, hands pressed over her mouth in surprise. The dwarves stirred at her gasp, rubbing sleep from their eyes as they blinked at her. The boldest among them stepped forward. His voice was kind, but curious, as he asked who she was, where she had come from, for they rarely saw humans this deep in their woodland home. Returning from a long mining expedition, only to find a girl asleep in their cabin, was something far beyond ordinary. In a rush of breath, Snow White explained everything. How she had lost her way, how far she had wandered, how cold and hungry she had been. She apologized earnestly for entering their home without permission, and promised she would gladly bake them a fresh loaf to replace the one she had eaten. The dwarves, gentle-hearted if a bit awkward around strangers, felt sympathy gather around them like a shared coat. After a short, murmuring council, they agreed she must stay, at least until they could decide how best to help her. Snow White nearly cried with relief. Brightly, she offered to tend the fires, clean the rooms, wash linens, and prepare meals, though it would soon become clear that her cooking left much to be desired. Still, she learned quickly, always eager, always grateful. The dwarves lived in peaceful isolation, and no bird nor beast brought word of any missing princess. Days folded into weeks, and weeks slipped quietly into winter. Before long, the dwarves could scarcely remember life without her gentle presence. Snow White, too, found contentment. She delighted in keeping the house tidy and warm. And she found, much to her joy, that the dwarves were remarkably wise. Their wisest member took her under his wing, offering evening lessons by lamplight. He opened ancient books with curling scripts, taught her ciphering and curious symbols, and read to her tales of heroes and kingdoms long forgotten. Slowly, Snow White grew not only more graceful, but more clever and well-learned, her mind blooming like spring after long winter. But far away, in the castle where cold ambition dwelled, the mirror had not forgotten her. Months after the princess's banishment, the queen stood once more before her enchanted looking-glass. Carelessly, she recited the familiar rhyme, looking glass, on the wall, who is the fairest of us all? She expected the same pleasing reply, but instead heard, "My queen, your beauty still shines bright, but the fairest now is Snow White." The queen froze. Then fury cracked through her, like lightning. Snow White lived. Somehow, impossibly, she had survived. At once, the queen summoned a famous huntsman and commanded him to find the girl and end her life. Tempted by a heavy purse of gold, he agreed. For weeks he searched the forest, speaking with wanderers and hermits, until at last he learned that a girl matching Snow White's description lived with the 7 dwarves. When he found the cottage, he watched Snow White tending a tiny garden, humming softly to herself. Even in simple clothes, she looked so gentle, so kind, that his heart faltered. He could not harm her. He returned to the queen, refusing to finish the deed. The queen raged and refused his payment, but the huntsman would not be moved. He had seen goodness with his own eyes. When he left, she realized she would have to deal with Snow White herself. Drawing upon her dark magic, she disguised her face and form until she resembled an ordinary peddler woman. Among the trinkets she carried was one that mattered, a beautiful hair comb studded with tiny, glittering gems. Upon this, she cast a spell, one that would lull its wearer into deep sleep, a sleep from which there would be no return. Then, cloaked in the quiet darkness of night, she slipped away from the castle, guided by the huntsman's directions and by the venom of envy that burned in her heart. It was well into the long, quiet hours of the next day when Snow White finally wandered her way toward the little cabin hidden deep within the whispering woods. The forest seemed half asleep around her, leaves breathing softly in the breeze, branches bending as if to guide her along. As she approached the cottage gate, a gentle voice drifted ahead of her. A woman's voice, sweet and coaxing, singing a lilting tune that invited anyone inside to come out and see the treasures she carried. Snow White, hearing the melody like a distant lullaby, peeked through the window with her dark hair falling softly around her face, her rose-red lips parting with curiosity. A moment later, she eased the door open just a little, cautious, yet polite. And there, smiling as though she were merely a friendly traveler, stood the queen in disguise, her voice as smooth as warm honey, her gestures soft and welcoming. "Come, child," she murmured sweetly. "Come and see the lovely things I have brought." And Snow White, gentle-hearted and curious as any lonely young girl living far from the world, stepped closer to the gate to glimpse what wonders the stranger offered. The queen showed her trinkets one by one, each presented like a secret gift, until at last she drew a delicate comb from within her cloak, gleaming dark gold, shimmering in the sunlight like captured starlight. Snow White gasped softly, unable to hide her delight. She accepted the comb with both hands, turning it this way and that, letting it catch the forest light before lifting it toward her ebony hair. "Try it on," whispered the queen, leaning close as though sharing a cherished truth. "It will look beautiful in those midnight dark locks." Snow White, who owned so few fine things and treasured every simple wonder, could not resist. She slid the comb gently into her hair and turned toward the cottage window to admire it. But before her reflection could form, a sudden darkness washed through her, soft at first, then heavy as a deep river. Her knees gave way. She sank silently to the ground, folding like a dropped flower until she lay motionless in the grass. The queen's cold smile spread across her face. Soft laughter of triumph slipped from her lips as she turned away, satisfied at last. Her plan had worked. Snow White lay still as carved ivory, the forest quiet around her. Hours later, when the dwarves returned from their long day of labor in the hills, they found her lying in the garden path, pale and silent, like a fallen porcelain figurine. With cries of fear, they gathered around her, lifting her hands, fanning her cheeks, calling her name. She did not stir. Her lashes rested like quiet shadows on her skin. But hope, fragile though it was, never left them. As they gently turned her head, one of the dwarves noticed the strange comb woven into her hair, an ornament he had never seen before. The wisest among them leaned forward, brow furrowed, and carefully tugged the comb free. As the last tooth slipped from her hair, a soft wave of dark curls tumbled down her cheek. And then, like morning light flickering through half-closed shutters, Snow White's lashes fluttered. Her eyes opened, hazy with confusion, drifting from face to face as if waking from a dream. The dwarves helped her sit up, surrounding her with anxious questions. What had she been doing? What caused her to faint? Had someone come to the cottage? With innocent honesty, she told them about the traveling peddler and the glittering comb she had accepted, still bewildered that the woman had left without waiting for payment. The dwarves traded dark looks. They knew then, without doubt, that evil still hunted their princess. They brought her inside, easing her into a chair, offering her water and warm food, urging her to rest while they murmured in worried tones among themselves. That evening, when the fear had quieted and their thoughts were clearer, they spoke gently but earnestly to Snow White. She must never again accept gifts from strangers, they warned. Someone was searching for her, someone determined and dangerous. She must be careful, more careful than ever before. Snow White, wide-eyed and trembling slightly, promised she would not be so trusting again. But only a handful of peaceful days passed before her promise faced its first test. One bright afternoon, while she worked among the vegetables in the sunlight, a young man appeared at the gate, leading a handsome horse. He seemed taken aback to find a cottage hidden in these deep woods, and even more startled to see such a lovely girl kneeling among the rows of green. Sweeping his hat off, he bowed politely, eyes warm with admiration. He introduced himself kindly, explaining that he lived not far away and was exploring the nearby villages. Looking around, puzzled yet intrigued, he asked who she lived with in such a quiet place, and how they had never met before. Snow White, remembering her promise to the dwarves, answered gently but guardedly. She lived as a housekeeper here, she said softly, though the half-truth sat uneasily in her heart. She bent back to her work, reminding herself the caution was necessary. He didn't press her. Instead, he rested his arms casually on the gate and began to talk about his journeys, the winding forest paths, the beauty he found in solitude. And though she tried to steel herself, Snow White felt her curiosity kindle again. Soon she was answering him, smiling shyly, offering thoughtful replies. She had grown intelligent and well-read during her time in the cottage, and she found herself unable to hide her delight in conversation. They remained like that, he leaning on the gate, she sitting in the soft garden earth, for a very long while. Only when the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the path did Snow White remember that the dwarves would return soon. Embarrassment fluttered in her chest. She knew they would worry if they found her chatting with a stranger. Sensing her discomfort, the young man bowed once more. With a sparkle in his eye, he promised he might pass through again soon. And he fully meant it, for Snow White was the most enchanting soul he had ever met. Far away, however, high in the cold stone chambers of her distant castle, the queen was preparing to ask her dark mirror yet another question, unaware that her plans had once again failed. Standing before its black surface, she spoke the familiar words with unshaken confidence. Looking glass, on the wall. Tell me, who is the fairest of them all? Softly, almost like a sigh drifting across a quiet room, the mirror spoke again. My queen, your beauty still glimmers, but Snow White's shines brighter still. And though the words were no louder than a whisper, they struck the queen like a blow. Her heart tightened, her breath trembled. She had been certain the girl remained trapped beneath her enchantment. Yet somehow Snow White had slipped free once more. And so, in the deep hush of her chambers, she made a cold and silent vow. Her work would not be left unfinished. Far away, where gentle winds curled between the pines, Snow White and the 7 dwarves sat together around a small fire, laughing softly as they shared tales of the world. They had no notion of the danger stirring miles behind them, for at that very hour, the queen was preparing again, this time with a disguise even more elaborate than before. She hunched her back like a weary traveler and draped herself in a dark, shapeless cloak. Her hands she made to tremble like old leaves in the wind. And into a woven basket she placed a simple cargo, fruit for the market. Nothing more, nothing less. A few days later, beneath the faint gray veil of early dawn, she set out once more. Now she knew the path by memory. Every turn, every lonely tree, every stone that marked the way. With patient, determined steps, she moved deeper into the forest, closer and closer to the dwarves' little cabin. She felt sure, utterly sure, that Snow White would not escape her this time. Snow White was outside, humming as she hung freshly washed clothes in the morning sun when the disguised queen shuffled into view. The girl's dark hair gleamed like polished ebony, and her movements were so light they almost seemed to float. The queen's heart twisted with jealousy at the sight, burning quietly beneath her calm facade. When the old woman called out, Snow White stopped her song mid-note and turned with caution in her eyes. "My dear child," the queen croaked softly, "how terribly warm the day has become. You must be thirsty, perhaps even faint." Snow White shook her head at once, firm, polite, but wary. She would not trust a stranger again, no matter how harmless she appeared. But the queen only smiled, as sweetly as the mask allowed. She reached deep into her basket, fingers brushing past the other fruit until she found the loveliest apple of them all, round, red, and shining as though kissed by sunlight. She held it up between them, letting it glow invitingly. Still, Snow White refused, insisting gently that she could not accept food from someone she did not know. The old woman chuckled as though she found this charming. Then, lifting a tiny knife, she sliced the apple straight down the center. To prove her innocence, or rather, to perfect her deception, she took a great, savoring bite from one half, letting the juice drip down her chin in the most convincing show she could manage. Snow White watched, her suspicion slowly softening. The queen had eaten it herself. Surely that meant it was safe. Drawn by hunger and the warm promise of kindness, Snow White stepped closer. She thanked the woman softly and accepted the untouched half. What she did not know was that the spell lay only in the side, still resting in her palm. A charm woven so delicately that even one small bite would send her into a deep and endless sleep. And so it was that Snow White took a gentle nibble, and in the hush of the garden, she once again fell to the earth, pale and still as falling snow. The queen, feeling triumph bloom darkly within her, turned away without a backward glance. She vanished among the trees, certain at last that her rival was gone forever. Hours passed before the dwarves returned from their day's work. Their cheerful steps faltered when they saw Snow White lying motionless on the path. Crying her name, they rushed to her, lifting her gently, searching desperately for any clue, a pin, a ribbon, a poisoned trinket. But they found nothing. Tears welled as they whispered to one another in fear and confusion. They could not bear to leave her lying on the cold ground. So together they lifted her carefully, although her height made the task awkward even for them, and carried her toward the cottage. But fate has strange and merciful ways. As they stumbled near the first bed, one dwarf slipped, and Snow White tumbled sideways onto the mattress. Their scolding voices filled the room until a sudden cough cut through the noise. Snow White sat up, hand pressed to her throat. color returning to her cheeks as though spring itself had touched her skin. The dwarves froze in astonished silence. Somehow, by sheer clumsy chance, the fall had shaken the poisoned piece of apple free. She lived again. Once she was well enough to speak, the dwarves scolded her with all the stern affection of worried guardians. Snow White bowed her head and confessed, embarrassed. The old woman had eaten the fruit first. How could she have suspected such a trick? But the dwarves insisted. No more gifts, no food, no jewelry, no tokens of any kind. She promised she would be careful. She knew how close she had come to a sorrowful fate. Yet even the best intentions tremble in the presence of a kind smile. So when the handsome young man returned days later, gentle-voiced, bright-eyed, she allowed herself a little warmth. She let him kneel beside her in the garden, even though he was terrible at pulling weeds. He was far too distracted by the delicate motion of her hands brushing the soil. He thought them the fairest hands he had ever seen. But far away, the queen's fury simmered anew. The mirror, faithful and cruel, revealed the truth once more. Snow White still lived. And at that revelation, the queen's resolve hardened into something sharp and cold. She knew the girl would never again accept a gift from a stranger. So she devised a subtler plan, a hidden poison, a spell that glimmered without seeming to glimmer at all. She took an ordinary ring, so thin and delicate it looked barely real, and wove her darkest magic into it. To mortal eyes, it would sparkle like treasure, a halo of shifting colors. To a young maiden, it would be irresistible. In the deep dark of early morning, the queen crept silently into Snow White's garden. She placed the enchanted ring among the tender leaves of the vegetable patch and disappeared into the forest's waiting shadows. Later that day, Snow White came humming softly, basket in hand, eager to gather ingredients for the evening meal. She had grown proud of her cooking. The dwarves had praised her broth just the night before. As she reached between the green rows, something glittered faintly beneath the sunlight. She bent closer. A ring, delicate, dazzling, shimmering with every color she could name. Red, blue, green. 100 shifting hues, like the heart of a rainbow. Breathless, entranced, she lifted it gently, and without a single thought, slipped it onto her finger. Instantly, her body slackened, and she fell softly to the earth, as though carried by sleep's slow hand. Hours later, the dwarves came home early, expecting an evening of rest, but their joy vanished the moment they saw her. Once again, they searched her hair, her clothes, the ground around her. Once again, they pleaded for her to wake. But this time, no coughing fit came. No accident saved her. Silently, sorrowfully, they removed their caps and sat around her, feeling the weight of helplessness settle upon their small shoulders like a long, cold night. This time, the little dwarves feared, with aching hearts, that their luck had finally run out, that no miracle, no hidden remedy in their forest home would be enough to bring their beloved Snow White back to them. They hovered around her still form like guardians of a fading light, whispering her name as if the sound alone might awaken her. Just then, soft as a breeze drifting through the garden, the young man who adored her stepped quietly through the gate. Under ordinary circumstances, the dwarves might have bristled at a stranger approaching their home, but they were far too sorrowful, far too exhausted by grief to even raise a concern. They simply stepped aside as he hurried toward them, his face pale with worry, his breath unsteady with fear. Kneeling at Snow White's side, he touched her cheek and her cold hands with trembling fingers, trying each gentle trick the dwarves themselves had attempted again and again. He whispered her name, begged her to wake, pleaded for even the tiniest sigh of life. But she did not stir, and so the quiet gathering became a sad, tear-soaked circle beneath the trees. The young man gazed down at her, and in that tender moment, the weight of his sorrow seemed almost too much to bear. His eyes drifted to her delicate hands, resting lightly upon her chest. There, upon her finger, he noticed a small ring glimmering faintly, catching what little light the fading day still offered. Curious, he looked up at the dwarves and asked gently if they had given Snow White this new trinket. The dwarves, puzzled and slightly alarmed, peered closely at her hand. To them, being creatures of the forest, untouched by human embellishment, there were no sparkling gems or fine gold. All they saw was the thinnest, simplest band of metal. They shook their heads, admitting that even this plain ring was unfamiliar to them. One of the dwarves, cautious yet hopeful, reached down and slowly slid the band from her finger. And then, like the first breath of dawn breaking through a long night, Snow White inhaled sharply. Color blossomed across her cheeks. Her chest rose in another breath, and another. A collective cry of joy burst from the dwarves as she fluttered her long lashes once, twice, and finally opened her eyes. The garden itself seemed to glow. The dwarves danced in circles, laughing, weeping, calling her name with pure delight. The young man, meanwhile, caught her hands in his smile trembling with relief and wonder. Snow White lifted herself slightly, meeting his gaze as if awakening into a dream made real. She prayed silently that the moment would not vanish, that this warmth and safety were not illusions. And then, in that hushed breath between heartbeats, they understood something together. Neither could imagine a life without the other. Something gentle and new, yet deep as the roots of the ancient forest, had taken hold. Softly, the young man asked her, his voice barely more than a whisper, if she might consider becoming his wife. With shy honesty, he confessed that he was, in truth, a prince, though he had kept it secret. He had feared that revealing his title would change their friendship, their easy laughter, their quiet afternoons, wandering the garden paths. Snow White laughed, her voice warm and musical, and admitted that she herself was a princess. But then she grew thoughtful, her expression dimming. She told him how she had lost her way long ago, how no one had come searching, how she feared her father no longer loved her or even remembered her. The prince took her hands more firmly, asking if she would ever dare to place a new ring upon her finger, since the last one had treated her so poorly. Snow White, finding her spirit again, teased him gently and said yes, she would, but only if she could choose it herself. Far away in the castle, however, the queen's wickedness did not remain hidden. The huntsman, tormented by guilt, confessed everything to the king. The plot, the lies, the cruelty. Without wasting a moment, the king set out to find his daughter, and with trembling joy discovered her safe and alive, embraced by those who loved her. And so, Snow White's story came to rest in light rather than shadow. She remained the fairest in the land, not for her beauty alone, but for her kindness, her courage, and her gentle heart. She wed her prince in a celebration so joyful that the whole kingdom seemed to glow with happiness. Everyone who wished to come was welcomed. Everyone except the queen, whose heart had carved her own fate. And there, in warmth and peace, Snow White and her prince began their new life, one filled with hope, laughter, and the promise of happily ever after.